And tonight on Coast to Coast, we're going to talk about mind power. Dr. Joe Dispenza joins us, breaking the habit of being yourself, how to lose your mind and create a new one. We'll get ready for that. We'll be back with Dr. Joe in a moment on Coast to Coast AM. And welcome back to Coast. George Norrie with you. Dr. Joe Dispenza studied biochemistry at Rutgers University. He holds a Bachelor of Science degree with an emphasis in neuroscience as well. He received his postgraduate training and continuing education in neurology, brain function chemistry, aging, longevity. Dr. Joe educates people about the functions of the human brain, and he has taught thousands, literally thousands, how to reprogram their thinking. Fascinating new work here called Breaking the Habit of Being Yourself. Tonight, our special guest, Dr. Joe Dispenza. Joe, how are you?
Very good, George. Thank you. I'm happy to be with you.
Me too. I'm looking forward to this. You know, the brain has so many different abilities. You know, to me, it's like the computer of the body. And people always say, Joe, that, you know, we only use 10% of our brain. How do they know that?
Well, that was a myth that was probably created about 25 years ago. The reason being is because we have part of our brain called the neocortex, which is our thinking brain. And it's made up of gray matter called nerve cells. And then underneath it is another part of the brain that's made of white matter. And there's about 10 times to 9 times amount of white matter compared to gray matter. So the mathematics was simple. Well, if there's, if there's a certain percentage of gray matter and then 9 times the amount of white matter, we would say, well, that white matter isn't as functional. That doesn't process thought. So the myth said, well, we use about 1/10 of our brain. And so that isn't actually the truth, but if you look at functional brain scans, or you look at people when you study a brain in action, when you study the brain in action, that's called mind, we can see that the brain doesn't work in such, coherent fashions. We don't use, all the brain at once.
Would you say, Joe, that if the brain was used all at once, that it might have a bigger capacity than a computer?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. We haven't even tapped the potential.
That is truly amazing, isn't it, when you think of that?
Yeah, the amazing thing about mind, and mind is the brain in action, or mind is the brain at work, if you have 100 billion neurons that make up the brain, and they're seamlessly pieced together, and mind is the brain in action, that means we can make the brain work in different sequences, different patterns, and different combinations. And if you have 100 billion neurons, we should be able to make the brain work in many different patterns. So we're just beginning to step outside the box of what's possible.
Joe, when somebody injures their brain and they, put them through a brain scan and they're able to say, all right, you've got damage here or this, how do they know that? How does that show up on these scans?
Well, when you study functional imagery, and this is what has taken brain science to the next level. 25 or 30 years ago, if you had an injury to your brain, the common procedure was they did a CAT scan or an MRI. They took a snapshot of your brain. And the snapshot basically tells you that there's broken parts or missing pieces or damaged areas. A functional brain scan is like a motion picture of the brain. And when you see that brain moving in different patterns and sequences, and certain areas lit up and other areas cooled down or shut off, you know that area is not functioning properly or it's working too hard. So the motion picture of the brain tells us so much information because now we can look at trends and patterns. For example, there's many different types of ADD. You can see when a person's functionally aggressive, or when you see when someone's holding on to a problem, or you can see when there's anxiety or depression, or certain areas are working too hard. So functional imagery is taking brain science to the next level.
You talk about in breaking the habit of being yourself, how to lose your mind and create a new one. Tell me about that headline just all by itself, breaking the habit of being yourself. What does that mean?
Well, by the time we're 35 years old, the psychological and neuroscientific model says that by the time we're 35 years old, we've memorized a set of behaviors, emotional reactions, and thought patterns that have become part of our identity, and that if 95% of who we are by the time we're 35 is a memorized set of programs, then the greatest habit we have to break is the habit of being ourselves.
All right, let's get into some of these areas that you talk about change, and you say that there are 3 areas. Let's go through them if you could explain that, Joe.
Sure. Well, the most common thing, let's just say that we make the assumption that the way you think has something to do with your life, or the way you think has something to do with your destiny. Well, the first thing that we have to do is we have to overcome our most present familiar environment, our familiar life. So if you wake up in the morning and you get out of bed and you shut the alarm clock off with the same finger that you did yesterday, you slip into your favorite slippers, you walk into the bathroom, you use the toilet like you always do, then you look in the mirror to remember who you are, and you wash yourself off the same way as you always do, and then you drink coffee out of your favorite mug, and then you go to work by driving in the same route that you did yesterday. You see the same people that push the same emotional buttons. You do the same things that you've memorized and you can do so well. Then you hurry up and go home so you can hurry up and check your emails, so you can hurry up and do it all over again. It begs the question, did your brain change at all that day? We could say that you were thinking the same thoughts, performing the same actions, living by the same emotional states, and secretly expecting something different to happen in your life. So neuroscience says that your brain is organized to reflect everything you know in your life. Your brain is a record of your environment. So as you see the same people and you go to the same places and you do the same things at the same time, it's the external environment that's turning on different circuits in your brain, causing you to think equal to everything that you know, react unconsciously to everything familiar in your life. And as long as you keep turning on the same circuits in the same way as you recognize the same thing, the principle in neuroscience says that nerve cells that fire together wire together. We begin to hardwire our brains into very specific patterns that reflect our external world. So to change then is to think greater than the environment, to think greater than the conditions in your life. And I think every great person in history understood this, whether it was William Wallace or Mahatma Gandhi or Martin Luther King, Joan of Arc, Queen Elizabeth I. They all had a vision. They all had an idea. And they were so passionate about that idea that they couldn't live any other way. So it begs the question, can you believe in a future that you can't see or experience with your senses yet, but you've thought about enough times in your mind that your brain has literally changed to look like that event has already happened? Now, the neuroscientific model of reality says it's absolutely possible that we can change our brains just by thinking differently. And to change, then, is to overcome the present associations in your life to begin to think and act greater than those conditions.
Okay, I would agree with that. I would agree with that entirely. Some of the other areas that people is meditation a lot of this?
Well, my interest has always been in demystifying the mystical. I think this is a time in history where people not only want to know, but they want to know how. And so the word meditation literally means to become familiar with, to make known. The symbol in ancient Tibetan means to become familiar with. Now, because of the size of our frontal lobe, that's the crowning achievement of the human being. It's 40% of our entire brain. That's what separates us from all other species. The next closest species, primates and gibbons, about 14 to 17%. Dogs are about 7%. And for cats, it's about 3.5%. Now, the frontal lobe is where we begin to pay attention or become conscious of who we are. That concept in neuroscience is called metacognition. The fact that we can observe our thoughts, we can pay attention to our behaviors, we can notice how we feel. It means that we can modify our behaviors to do a better job in life. So the word meditation, then, to become familiar with, if you're noticing your unconscious thoughts because you've closed your eyes and eliminated the environment, you've become aware of your unconscious habits or behaviors, and you begin to feel your emotions that are typically driving you to the same state. The fact that you're beginning to observe them means now you're no longer the program, but you're the consciousness observing the program. So the first step in meditation, then, is the unlearning process. It's to become aware of the old self, the aspects of ourselves that we want to change, to go into the operating system of those subconscious programs and bring them to our conscious awareness so that we have dominion over them and a better ability to change them. Now, The second part of meditation, if we look at the word to become familiar with again, means then, as we begin to think of new ways of being, as we begin to speculate new possibilities, that frontal lobe turns on again, and it's like a great symphony leader. It looks out over the landscape of the entire brain, and if we said, well, what is compassion, or what is joy, or what is freedom? Well, it begins to assemble all these different networks of neurons, and it combines them in different patterns. Whenever we begin to make the brain work differently, now we're changing the mind. And so in the first step, we're unfiring and unwiring those neurons, and then we begin to biologically prune away the old self. As we begin to think about new ways of being and speculate possibilities, we begin to fire and wire new sequences and new patterns, and we begin to install the neurological hardware. And if we practice that every day, we begin to become familiar with a new self, and that becomes the very platform of our identity.
Joe, there's an old saying, of course, leopards don't change their spots. I've always believed that if one is an alcoholic, he or she will always be an alcoholic. They may not drink, they may be able to control themselves, but they're still alcoholics. If somebody's a child abuser, they're still pedophiles. They may, through therapy, stop doing what they've done, but I still think they're pedophiles. Is that true? Can people change or not?
According to the neuroscientific model, this principle that we call neuroplasticity says that we're changed by every thought we think, every behavior or choice that we make that's different than the past, every dream that we speculate, every vision that we have. Our brain literally reorganizes itself to reflect a new level of mind. So given the right learning and the right instruction and the right feedback from the neuroplastic model, people can evolve out of an old self and literally re-enter into a new self. The key is to be able to sustain that change independent of the environment, which, of course, causes us to return back to the old self.
I was going to say, you don't think, though, that people generally will drift back to whatever they were doing before?
You know, it's kind of a funny concept, but your body is your greatest mind reader in the world. Your body is precognitive. And so most of the time, you know, when we make a decision to change, you know, if you were sitting down and 9 out of 10 times you said to yourself, I'm going to fake standing up, but one time out of those 10 times I'm actually going to stand up. Well, before you even made the conscious decision to stand up, your adrenal glands would squirt out a certain amount of adrenaline to keep the same volume of blood going to your brain. In other words, your body was ahead of your conscious mind. Now, when most people make a decision to change, you know, they're typically sitting on a couch, they have the remote control in their hand, they have their computer to the right, they have their smartphone to the left, and they say, yeah, I think I'm going to change tomorrow. And so the body, as the unconscious mind, doesn't get the signal that the person is really going to make any significant change. The body already knows that that person's not coming out of their resting state to change. but if you ever said to yourself, I'm going to do this, and you say, I don't care what's going on in my life, that's the environment. I don't care how I feel, that's your body. I don't care how long it takes, that's time. I'm going to do this, and the hair on the back of your neck stands up. The body gets a very strong signal, and that type of signal begins to rewrite those programs.
Now, that takes training, though, doesn't it?
Absolutely. It takes, or it's kind of a funny condition, but we really change in one of two states. Most people, and this is the human condition, wait for crisis or trauma or disease or diagnosis or loss to get about the business of change. Now, we reach our lowest denominator, and all of a sudden we start to get serious and we begin to examine who we're being. Or, you know, we can learn and change in a state of pain and suffering, or we can learn and change in a state of joy and inspiration. I think my message is, why wait? Why wait till we reach the lowest denominator before we make that decision? So when we reach that lowest point, we get serious enough where we can't go on being the same person any longer. And when we reach that point, you know, it's kind of a human condition. That's when we really say, okay, Let me look at the thoughts I no longer want to believe in about myself or my life, and let me begin to examine my habits and behavior that undermining my efforts or my goals, and let me look at these emotions that aren't loving to myself, and let me choose something else. We can do that, with the training to understand.
Well, one of the things, for example, Joe, that I have a difficult time grasping, for example, New Year's resolutions. I mean, we come up to the new year, and people try to set goals and objectives for themselves, whether it's a better job or to lose weight or a better relationship, but they always tend to put it off until New Year. They make that resolution. I'm going to lose 35 pounds in the new year. Why don't they just do it right then?
Well, this is the reason I wrote Breaking the Habit, and then this is the biggest reason why it's so hard to change, because we start out with really good intentions. We make a declaration. I'm going to lose weight. I'm going to be healthy. I'm going to exercise. And then 2 hours later, most people are sitting on a couch and they're watching their favorite
eating a pizza.
Eating the pizza and eating ice cream, and they've gone unconscious.
Which is not a bad idea later, but go ahead.
Well, if we examine this, let's take a look at this, because we said 95% of who we are by the time we're 35 years old is a set of unconscious thoughts, behaviors, and emotions or emotional reactions that are literally happening behind the scenes of our awareness. So if that's 95% of who we are, and people, will give you an example. A great example that I like to use is, if you grab the telephone, and, you'd have to be over 35 for this, but if you couldn't consciously remember a phone number, and you walked over to the receiver and you looked at the receiver, the moment you looked at the receiver, you would be able to dial that phone number. You couldn't consciously remember it, but your body practiced it so many times that it knew better than your brain.
It just knows what to do.
That's called a procedural memory, and that's a great example of a subconscious program. So we have all these subconscious programs. So then the moment we see some person, or we go to our favorite place, or we start doing the same things, we begin to go unconscious. So that's one of the reasons why it's important to get beyond the operating system of the conscious mind and enter into the subconscious operating system to make those changes. In other words, most people are trying to use 5% of their conscious mind to work against 95% of what they've memorized subconsciously. So they plan a new life consciously, but they feel unworthy. That's mind and body in opposition. They begin to think about being wealthy, but they feel poor. And so we have to begin to understand that there's a science that says we can begin to change the brain and body ahead of the environment. And that's what Breaking the Habit is about.
What is it, Joe, about the body that makes you move, for example, your arm? Before you move your arm, you think about it. There's that little voice in your head that goes, move your arm. And you move your arm or move your leg or stand up, as you were saying, or sit down. What is it in the brain? What is the brain talking to have you move that arm?
Well, who is that little voice anyway?
And who is that little voice? That's right.
Well, when we start out doing something, we start out unconsciously unskilled, which means we don't even know that we don't even know. As we begin to practice something or we begin to learn new things, we become consciously unskilled. Now we know that we don't know how to do it. If we keep persisting and we keep doing something over and over again, we begin to become consciously skilled. But the final step is that if we keep practicing something repeatedly over and over again through experience, we become unconsciously skilled, which means we've done it so many times that we begin to memorize that action.
Like swinging a baseball bat. Joe, we're going to hit this break. I want to come back and we'll talk to you in just a moment. Dr. Joe Dispenza's website is linked up at coasttocoastam.com. And we'll be right back as we talk about his work, Breaking the Habit of Being Yourself, right here on Coast to Coast AM. And our very special guest tonight, Dr. Joe Dispenza, as we talk about the power of the mind. Fascinating, truly fascinating indeed. So, Joe, like a great baseball player, they've got, incredible rhythm. What makes one ball player better than another?
You're asking me the hard questions, huh?
Yeah, I'm starting early with them, too.
Okay. Well, let me explain a concept that we're just beginning to understand from a neuroscientific model. And We actually have three brains, and those three brains allow us to go from thinking to doing to being.
Sometimes I've met people that didn't have any brains, Joe.
Well, we come with three brains in one, and the first brain is the neocortex. That's that walnut-covered brain that has all the folds and bumps and valleys. And that is the seat of your conscious awareness. And that every time you learn something new, you make a new connection in your thinking brain. That's what learning is. Learning is forging new connections. Remembering is maintaining and sustaining those connections. So you read the book on how to hit a baseball. You read a book on how to ride a bicycle. You read a book on how to dance the salsa. You read a book on how to cook Mandarin cuisine. You read a book on compassion or forgiveness.
Mm-hmm.
And all of that information is stored in your thinking brain. Now, as you review that information, as you repeat it, as you begin to contemplate on it, you're reinforcing those circuits, and repetition and our volition, repeating it, begins to fire and wire those circuits in your thinking brain. So it's philosophy, it's theory, it's intellectual data, it's facts, it's knowledge. Now, when you take what you learn intellectually and you apply it, or you personalize it, or you demonstrate it, it means now you're going to have to modify your behavior in some way, change your actions. And when you do that, you have a new experience. So now, in the midst of an experience, everything you're seeing and smelling and tasting and feeling and hearing, all of your five senses are immersed into the external environment. And as your brain is beginning to gather all of this sensory data, all that information is rushing back to your brain, and jungles of neurons are beginning to organize themselves into patterns. The moment those neurons string into place, they release a chemical, and that chemical is called a feeling or an emotion. When that happens, we activate the second brain, called the limbic brain, or the emotional brain, or the chemical brain. So you read the book on forgiveness, and you have all this information stored in your thinking brain, or you read the book on how to hit a baseball. Now, all of that information you have to do something with. Now, when you get your behaviors to match your intentions, or you get your actions equal to your thoughts, or you get your body involved in some way, when you actually change your actions, that experience begins to reinforce the circuits in your brain neurologically, and it begins to chemically condition or chemically instruct your body to teach it what your mind has intellectually understood.
All right, but I may get this book on how to play the piano, and I may read it cover to cover 3 times. I still may never be a great piano player, Joe.
True. Well, there's a couple ingredients that allow us to get to that point. One of it is attention. And when we pay attention to what we're doing, attention is one of the key elements that allows us to begin to unify mind and body. So if a person can't restrain their impulsive habits and behaviors and begin to get their body to respond in different ways, if they can't get that alignment working, more than likely they won't be able to develop a skill. But let's just say, though, that a person continues to practice through repetition. They keep doing something over and over again. If we keep doing something and re-experiencing the same event, we begin to neurochemically condition the body to memorize that behavior as well as the conscious mind. And whenever the mind and body are working together, now we're in a state of being, and we activate that third brain called the cerebellum. That's the seat of the subconscious. That's where when we've practiced something so many times, we don't have to think about it any longer. So when it gets to that point, it begins to become innate. It begins to become subconscious. It begins to become automatic. And so the skill that we develop from practicing anything requires attention, it requires learning, it requires the proper instruction, and it requires repetition. Now, some people can relax into it a little easier than others, but those ingredients, if we keep doing it enough times, will begin to assemble mind and body to work together.
Fascinating how this all works. Who in the heck thought of this?
A lot of people sitting around asking the question, how does this work?
Are you particularly spiritual? Do you believe in a divine creator? I ask you that Because, to me, you're a scientist right now, and I'd love to get your views on whether you think this all had some design behind it.
Well, I consider myself a spiritual person because when you begin to study science and you begin to look at the nature of reality, if you're not fascinated by the fact that, our heart beats over 2 gallons of blood in a minute, over 200 gallons of blood in an hour, over 100,000 times in one day through 60,000 miles of blood vessels, and we lose 10 million cells every second, and we make 10 million cells the next second, or that in one cell it goes through the order of 100,000 chemical reactions in 1 second. If we don't begin to look at something that's giving us life, some intelligence that's organizing these functions, I think we go from a very we start to reduce life down to a very mechanistic model. And I think the more that I learn and the more that I study, the more I begin to realize that that's not how things really are. And with the advent of quantum physics and the understanding that there is the subjective mind has some effect on our objective world, starts to give us permission to become empowered and to begin to take control of our destiny.
Joe, does the abnormal mind create different kinds of people? And by that I mean whether they become serial killers or geniuses like an Albert Einstein. Does an abnormal brain, and to me that is a brain outside the normal function of a regular type brain, does that create those kinds of people?
Are you saying that are you asking me if the brain creates a personality?
Yeah. I mean, would a brain that just would not be considered normal, and I don't know what you would consider normal to be, but if a doctor said, he has an abnormal brain, if he was born that way, for example, there have been some cases where, they have said that these people have become serial killers. Something's wrong with them.
Sure.
What is it in the brain that has caused these people to do such heinous acts?
Well, there's a lot of reasons for that, George. We could say that, first of all, if you look at so many functional brain scans that I've actually had the privilege of looking at, there's not many normal brains out there. There tends to be more abnormal, which is
really
the normal. Yeah, and one of the biggest reasons for that is stress, and when we live responding and reacting to our environment so often, and we keep knocking the brain and body out of balance, that that imbalance becomes the new balance, and then we start heading for some type of disease or malady, mentally in mental health or physically in our body. But someone who's born with a chemical imbalance in their brain, or they've had a head injury early in life, or they've had
or a deformity,
or even, which is probably the most common, early childhood traumas, where they have been abused or exposed to some difficult conditions repeatedly. In that case, the brain adapts in certain ways so that the person can continue to function in their world. And whenever they experience the same or similar condition emotionally, they regress back to that person again. So, whether it's created genetically, or it's created by the environment, when there's an imbalance in the brain, when there's some type of chemical or neurological or anatomical imbalance in the brain, when the brain doesn't work right, we don't work right. And so, again, with the understanding of what looking at mind on functional scans, this is where brain science is beginning to become more of a science, a hard science, instead of a soft science. Again, if you have a problem with your heart, for the most part, you go to the doctor and he or she does a scan of your heart. If you have a gallbladder problem, you get an ultrasound of your gallbladder. Well, now, if you have a problem with your brain, for the most part, most people go to the doctor and you're given a pharmaceutical and, it sounds something like this. Well, try this out and see how you do, and let's see if this helps you. And then you go home and you say, God, I've lost my libido, I'm not hungry, and I can't sleep at night. And the doctor may say, well, take more, or they'll say, oh, that's not the right medication, try this medication. Now, that's guesswork. Now, because of functional imagery, can actually scan the brain, and we could say, that's not looking very good. And then we can try a pharmaceutical. We could even try nutritional supplements. We can try certain therapies. And then we can rescan the brain, and we can say, now that person looks better. Yeah, their brain is not working so hard, or that the brain is moving more towards balance. And no longer is it a subjective feedback, but now it's becoming more objective science.
You've talked about meditation on the program before, earlier, but different people would have different views on what meditation is, Joe, and yours is not like most. Tell me about that.
Well, I always say that if you get up from your meditation as the same person who sat down, nothing's really happened to you neurologically, biologically, genetically, or epigenetically. Nothing's happened to you in terms of change. I mean, we have to get up, and we have to feel differently than when we sat down. And if we begin to look at some of the latest research in studying brainwave patterns, and a lot of the research being done at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, but we have different types of brainwaves. I mean, we're talking right now and we're interacting, and for the most part, our brainwaves are in what's called beta brainwave patterns. That's thinking brainwave patterns. That's our analytical mind. We need that beta pattern to be able to navigate in our external world. And in beta, because of the patterns that are created, we're perking up our neocortex, and we're trying to create meaning between the outer world and the inner world. That's really the mechanism of the brain, to create coherence or meaning between what's going on outside of us, and what's going on inside of us. So when we're functioning in reality, we're producing beta wave patterns. Now, when you close your eyes and you begin to eliminate the external environment, and you begin to reduce the amount of sensory information that's coming to your brainwave patterns begin to slow down into what's called alpha brainwaves. Now, in alpha, the inner world tends to be more real than the outer world, and children usually from the ages of 0 to 7 or 10 usually are functioning normally in alpha, and that's why you can tell a child to act like a rabbit at 9 in the morning and 4 in the afternoon. She's still hopping around in the kitchen because the imaginary world is that real. If we begin to relax the body a little bit more, like when you're going to sleep and you begin to fall into a light sleep where the body begins to fall asleep and the mind is awake, that's called theta. Now, this is what I call magic land, because I said that a habit is when the body becomes the mind. So if we've put the body to sleep and it's no longer the mind, this is where change can happen the quickest. Now, delta is deep sleep. That's when the person's in a restorative state, and that's pretty much when they're unconscious. There's very little active conscious functioning in their neocortex. Now, most people move up and down the scale when they go to bed at night. They're going from beta to alpha to theta to delta. And when they wake up in the morning, because of brain chemistry, they're going from delta to theta to alpha to beta. Now, what the whole purpose of meditation is to get beyond the analytical mind and begin to move into the operating system of the subconscious mind, where all of those programs exist.
Is it kind of like trying to break down a layer or some kind of a shell?
It's kind of, so it's about slowing down your thinking brain. Now, here's most people's problems. Most people try to analyze their problems within the emotions that they're living by. And emotions are literally a record of your past experiences, so the solution is outside of that emotion, beyond your analysis. So most people, as they begin to analyze their problems, they drive their brain more into that higher beta pattern, and it moves them separate from the operating system to make the change. So when we begin to do our meditation, according to the latest research, there's absolute ways that we can begin to slow brainwave patterns down, to begin to move from the conscious mind into the subconscious mind to make those changes. And the type of brainwave patterns that seems to be the hot topic in neuroscience right now is what's called coherent brainwave patterns. Now, coherence is when, everything is operating in rhythm, when there's orderliness, when there's a rhythm, when there's synchrony, when everything's beginning to work together. And when the brainwave patterns move into that orderliness or that synchrony, It's a very specific way that the brain begins to work in a holistic fashion. And different compartments of the brain that were no longer communicating with each other because of the hormones of stress all of a sudden move into balance, and they begin to hold hands, and we begin to experience more wholeness or more orderliness, or we feel more like ourselves than we have in a long time. And that's that meditative state where we begin to relax and we begin to feel so good that we're no longer being affected by the external world. Now, this is the beauty, because if you practice this type of coherence and you begin to create this orderliness, the research shows that when the incoherence of your external environment no longer knocks you out of balance because you've memorized such a state of orderliness and coherence. So I use science pretty much as the model to begin to demystify meditation. And people who actually practice it and do it, it's a skill, just like golf or tennis. The more you practice it and the more you're able to remove yourself beyond your identity, that's when the brain and body happens to recalibrate and move back to order.
Let me ask you about people who generally are intuitive. Do they have different kind of brain functions in order to do that?
They actually do. Most people who are intuitive don't analyze with their thinking neocortex. They tend to slow that thinking part of their brain down, and they trust, for the most part, imagery or a stream of consciousness that is beyond their critical analytical mind, because the moment they start to rationalize what they're doing, they move out of the part of the brain where they actually have that skill. So, and the answer to the question is absolutely yes. They slow down their thinking brain in order to pick up information.
That is remarkable all by itself, isn't it?
It is, and that's a great example of quantum physics and non-locality. I mean, the fact that our awareness is so mobile, and that's really the privilege of being a human being. You know, we can unfold the past bitter memory that's tattooed in the recesses of our gray matter, and in the moment it comes to life, and in that moment it's real to us. Or we can begin to forecast some worst case scenario that's going to happen in our future, and we can obsess about it to the exclusion of everything else, so that the body begins to subconsciously or physiologically change as if it's in that future event in the moment. So if that's the case, can we begin to mobilize our awareness outside of time and space and to begin to pick up information that exists outside of linear time?
Joe, what makes some people more successful than other people? Not necessarily in just money, but they're generally more successful in life.
Well, I think I have to step outside the neuroscientific model, and I think that one of the key components really is that when people get clear on a vision or a purpose, we call that duty motivation or purpose motivation. They begin to get clear on a mission for themselves, and when they get clear on this type of long-term vision instead of a short-term goal, and that vision takes them out of their resting state, they begin to see the outcome without any obstacles, and they review that mission for themselves. And usually, the purpose or the mission is bigger than themselves. It's not just localized to making money, but it's something that they're contributing in a selfless way to the whole. People who have that type of vision and review that vision enough times is usually the people who get their behaviors to match their intentions. And when we hit adversity in our life or we hit obstacles, the next thing is adaptability, our ability to change and to learn what just happened and take another route or begin to change our actions in some way.
Joe, we're going to talk about how to change when we come right back on Coast to Coast AM. Well, with Dr. Joe Dispenza, his book, Breaking the Habit of Being Yourself. Joe, you have in part 3 techniques for people to start breaking the habit, but you really think they need to get through parts 1 and 2 in order to get that far, don't they?
Yeah, one of the things about change is that you got to understand how change works. You got to understand a little bit about how the brain and the body works, and you got to understand different states of mind. So the first 2 parts of the book really are just, simple science to help people understand who they are and what it is to change and why change is so hard, so that when we get to the third part of the book, which is the how-to, They know exactly what they're doing and why, and nothing's left to conjecture or dogma or speculation. They know what they're doing, and then when they have their intention behind it, it seems to work a lot better.
What is, in your opinion, the most important thing that people should be aware of if they want to change? Or even why change?
Well, I think most of us memorize certain emotions that become part of our identity. You know, when we react to something in our life, some condition in our life, as I said, the end product of an experience is an emotion. What most people don't know is that when they react to something in their life, there's a refractory period of chemicals that are created from that experience. And if you don't know how to control that emotional reaction, and you allow that refractory period to last for hours or even days, that's called a mood. So you see someone and you say to them, "What's wrong?" And they say, "Oh, I'm in a mood." And you say, "Well, why are you in a mood?" And they say, "Well, this thing happened to me 5 days ago." And what that really means is the same emotion chemicals are running through their body that are keeping them connected to a past experience. Now, if you keep that refractory period going on for weeks or even months, that's called a temperament. So you say, "Why is that guy so angry? And, why does he have such an angry temperament?" And so you ask him, "Why are you so angry?" And he says, "Well, this thing happened to me 10 months ago." And what he's really saying is, this thing happened to me 10 months ago, and I'm memorizing my emotional reaction. Now, if we keep that same refractory period going on for years on end, that's called a personality trait. So we tend to develop our personality based on past experiences that emotionally brand us. So in order to change our personality, we have to look at the emotions that we've memorized that's become part of our identity. And so to shorten refractory period of our emotional reactions is called emotional intelligence. And people who tend to hold on to experiences then tend to live by those emotions, which keeps them anchored in the past. And we can't go to a new future. We can't create a new life or a new future holding on to the emotions of the past. We have to begin to layer by layer begin to unmemorize those emotional states. And that's what the part 3 of the book is about. What emotion have you memorized that's become part of your identity? That's actually not who you are. It's just your memory of the past. And so when you teach people how to change those emotional states, you liberate some energy. And, of course, they see a new landscape that they never saw before because they're not perceiving reality through the filter of that emotion. They're not looking at reality through the past.
Joe, how do people know that they need to change? You know, a lot of people don't know themselves. So how do they know they should change?
Well, one of the feedback mechanisms that we know we need to change is our life. You know, you look in the mirror and you see your face, and that reflection tells you who you are as an identity. Our life is a reflection of our mind or our ego, and the way we begin to see that it's time to change is we start getting feedback in the form of situations in our life that are showing us that the things that we're doing repeatedly aren't producing a result that we want, or the feedback from our body. In other words, we start to get sick or we don't feel as well, and we begin to notice that we're no longer feeling like ourselves any longer. So the feedback mechanism that we get through our life or our environment, through our body, is usually a strong enough signal for people to begin to say, "I don't look good," or "I don't feel good," or, "Gosh, this thing keeps showing up in my life, and I need to begin to make changes." So feedback is the mechanism that lets us know.
It's pretty dramatic. Now, when you were doing all of this, did you come across any pitfalls in the research? Anything that you found that, this is going to be a tough one to work on?
Well, I think that change is tough, period, George. I think that to begin to make sustained changes in our life, given the fact that most of us are busy and we have families and we have jobs and, we're multitasking, change isn't as easy as, I just want to eat vanilla ice cream instead of chocolate ice cream. That's not really changing your mind. There has to be an effect that begins to happen in the body. And one of the things that I noticed in studying change is that many people, they have a desire or a dream to change something about themselves, but they actually don't think it's possible on any level or on a subconscious level. So one of the things we've also noticed is that when you give people information on how change occurs neurologically and biologically, and you give them the resources on how to do it, they'll make a stronger effort. And the hardest part of all of this, the hardest part without a doubt in the change game, is making the time to do it. Making time for ourselves to begin to, remove ourselves from our predictable lives and take time for ourselves to begin to ask some important questions like, what is a greater expression of myself? What's a greater way to be? What do I have to change about myself in order to change? Who in history do I admire? Do I want to be like? And what do I want to be in my future? And these type of open-ended questions, these type of frontal lobe questions, I call them, are the questions that begin to change the mind. Now, making time for ourselves to begin to separate ourselves from our life and to begin to think and feel differently begins to produce amazing results. Now, the Newtonian model of reality is about cause and effect. In other words, the external environment, something outside of us, changes how we feel inside of us. And when we notice that we feel altered inside of us, we pay attention to whoever or whatever caused that.
Events occur, right?
Right. And that cause and effect is really us living at the victims to the environment. Now, the true aspect of change it has nothing to do with the environment changing how we think and feel. The true aspect of change is coming out of our resting state and changing how we think and feel independent of the environment. And when we change how we think and feel independent of the environment and we can maintain that modified state of mind and body, now we're no longer living at cause and effect, but now we are in fact causing an effect. This is where people begin to feel empowered. So you and I have been hypnotized and conditioned into believing that we need a reason for joy, that we need a reason for gratitude, we need a reason to feel good. That's that Newtonian model of cause and effect. The quantum model says this: your subjective mind, how you think and feel, produces measurable effects. But I think that most people, the model is our personality creates our personal reality. It's that simple. And our personality is made up of how we think, how we act, and how we feel. So the present personality who's listening on the radio show today has created their present personal reality called their life, which means then if you wanted to create a new personal reality, a new life, you would have to change on some fundamental level the thoughts you think, the behaviors that you demonstrate, and the emotions that you live by. So if we need a reason for gratitude, we need a reason for joy, then we're at effect. We're always waiting for something to happen. The quantum model says, let's begin to move into an elevated state. Let's begin to condition the body into believing that future event is happening to us now. And when we make time for ourselves to practice this, then we're no longer living life as materialists any longer, using our senses to define reality. We're actually changing inside of us in mind and body, and then looking for the effects outside of us. And when people begin to understand that that's possible, change becomes more inspiring.
Is meditation the same as self-hypnosis?
That's a great question, and my answer is yes. My answer is absolutely yes, because whether you're doing a meditation or you're doing self-hypnosis, brainwave patterns tend to be exactly the same. And when you get beyond that analytical mind, that's when you can begin to imprint information or code information into the subconscious. So, 5% of our mind is our conscious mind, and 95% is our subconscious. And what separates those two is the analytical mind. And again, then when we get beyond that analytical mind, we are entering into that domain. So yes, they're very similar.
Joe, I know some people in St. Louis that are nice people, but some of them just don't have that personality. They chase people away. They go into a room and, rather than people feeling electrified, they run away. They can't stand it. What are they doing wrong, and how do people like that change their life?
Well, this is a long conversation.
That's a long show.
But let's get back to the hormones of stress. Listen, when you and I, well, first of all, stress is when your body's knocked out of homeostasis. Stress is when your body's knocked out of balance. The stress response is what your body innately does to return back to order, to return back to balance. Now, every single organism in nature is designed for short-term stress. A gazelle is, grazing in the Serengeti. The lion sees the gazelle. As soon as the lion begins to notice one gazelle walking out of pattern in the herd, she senses weakness, and she turns on a primitive nervous system called her fight-or-flight nervous system. And when she turns on that primitive nervous system, she's saying, this is lunch for my cubs. And she begins to mobilize enormous amounts of energy so that she can begin to survive in her environment. Now, when the gazelle sees the lion, she turns on her fight-or-flight nervous system or her sympathetic nervous system, and she's saying, I have to get away from this predator. Now, if the gazelle outruns the lion, 15 minutes later, it goes back to grazing. In other words, the stress is over. Human beings, well,
they fester.
Way.
No.
We turn on the stress response. We can turn on that stress response just by thought alone. We can begin to speculate some possibility. We can begin to think of some worst-case scenario. We can begin to try to predict the future based on the past. And the privilege of being a human being, because of the size of the frontal lobe, is that we can make thought more real than anything else. And as we begin to attend to those thoughts, we begin to knock our body out of balance just by thought alone. And when we keep knocking the body out of balance, when we turn on the stress response and we can't turn it off, now we're headed for disease. And those emotions of the chemicals of stress create the emotions of anger and aggression and hatred and frustration and fear and anxiety and insecurity and depression and pain and suffering and hopelessness and powerlessness. Those states we've considered normal states of human consciousness, and they're actually what I call altered states of consciousness. The normal states of human consciousness is what mystics and poets have been talking about for generations, where we feel elevated and we feel lifted and we feel clear and our mind and body is healthy. So those hormones of stress, when we mobilize all that energy, we become junkies to that rush of energy. It's like a triple cappuccino. And so we look for the conditions in our life to reaffirm that rush so that we can remember who we think we are. And so we become enslaved to those emotions of stress, and then those emotions of stress begin to cause us to become very selfish, very self-involved, very self-centered, very self-indulgent, very self-serving. Because when those hormones of stress are running, it's all about the body, the environment, and time. We become obsessed with our bodies, our body parts. We become obsessed with things we should own, things we should have, things in our environment, and we become obsessed about time. And when we move into that state, we're trying to define reality by our senses. We're trying to control our reality by living as materialists. And that, of course, is when we begin to push out or hold on, or we try to manipulate or be cunning, and greed and deception, dishonesty. It's all created from those emotions of stress, and we become enslaved to it.
Chapter 7 of your book is called The Gap. What is that?
Well, I think we reach a point in our life, by the time we're 35 or 45 years old, right in that range, where we've experienced most of what life has to offer. We've had relationships, we understand sexuality, we've been successful, we've failed, we've felt most of the emotions that come along with being a human. And when we reach this point where we can predict the feeling of how everything is going to happen in our life, all of a sudden we realize that there isn't much that life has to offer. And, we grow up as children and we have certain experiences that knock us out of balance, and we begin to feel certain ways. But because we can put all of our attention on the external environment, we can, begin to identify and create an identity by identifying with things in our outer world, we can distract ourselves from those feelings that we have as children. So we begin to create this gap. And if you take one hand and you place it about eye level and the other hand at your waist level,
that gap, the upper hand, represents how we appear to the world, the identity or the image we project to the external world. That's the facade. And how we really feel inside is those emotions that we've been running away from, that emptiness or that insecurity. Now, for the first several years of our life, the first 35 years of our life, we can, get a job or go to school or learn new things or get married and get divorced or have kids and do all these things, buy cars, buy homes to distract us from that feeling. Well, right around 35 or 45, all of a sudden, nothing's making that feeling go away any longer.
Not at all. You're not happy with possessions.
That's right. You become possessed by your possessions, and you begin to realize that there's got to be something more to life. And this is when the soul begins to wake up and nudge us and start to say, pay attention to this feeling, because if you don't look at this feeling, you're never going to evolve in your life. Now, this is the midlife crisis, and some people actually look down at that emotion and they say, look, I never loved you. I don't even know what love is. I don't want to go out with those people any longer. I don't want to fake that I'm happy. What is God? What is life? What happens after we die? They start asking some really important questions, and everybody in their life thinks that they're losing their mind, and so they try to help them return back up to that top hand again, that the image or the ideal for the world instead of the ideal for themselves. And so they go to the doctor and they get Prozac, and all of a sudden the feeling goes away, and they return back to the same identity. Other people, this is a midlife crisis, they try to create a new identity by, getting new, creating new things in their environment to create a new identity. They buy the sports car, they buy the boat, they get the facelift, they join a new social club to meet new people. They go on vacation to a new place. They buy new things. It's all about the environment to try to make this feeling go away. And then when the novelty of those things wear off, that feeling comes back. And this is where it gets pretty intense, because the whole next level has to do with addiction. This is where people begin to drink more. They begin to shop more. They begin to use drugs, or they gamble, or they overeat, or they undereat, or they video game, or they do pornography, or whatever it is.
Whatever it is, yeah.
Try to make that feeling go away. And there's nothing, the beauty behind this is that human beings innately want to evolve. They want to change, but they think that change has to happen outside of them. Now, when they gamble, or when they shop, or when they use a drug, the rush of chemistry that's created in the brain and body is such an intense chemical rush that the receptor sites on the outside of the cells begin to become desensitized. And what happens is the next time they shop, the next time they gamble, the next time they use a drug, they need a little bit more. This then begins to hijack the pleasure centers to a higher level. So now they need more drugs to get the same high, or shop more. If they spend $5,000, now they need to spend $10,000 because $5,000 doesn't produce the same high. And as they begin to invest all of their energy into the external environment to begin to try to make that feeling inside of them go away immediately, the moment they notice that feeling going away inside of them, they pay attention to whoever or whatever caused it.
Well, that's a great point. Hold on, Joe. Let's talk more about that. We're also going to talk about consciousness when we come right back on Coast to Coast AM. Next hour, we'll take your phone calls with Dr. Joe Dispenza as we talk about his work, Breaking the Habit of Being Yourself. More questions, though, when we come right back on Coast to Coast AM. Joe, before we get into some more questions about this high, I think that was fascinating. Tell me about where we can get your book, Breaking the Habit of Being Yourself. And I also understand you also have some monthly teleclasses.
Yeah, the book is on Amazon right now, so you can order it off of Amazon. You can go to our website and order it off our website, drjoedispenza.com. And the teleclass that we've done is I do a lot of workshops around the world and in different parts of the country, and people want to stay connected to the work, or they want to ask questions, and we probably get over 100 emails a day, believe it or not, on our website. And so instead of us having to try to answer all of these, we've created a teleclass that's the last Thursday of every month. It's 12 in the afternoon Pacific time. And it's a 1 hour and 15-minute class. I do about 20 to 30 minutes where we develop a concept. And then we just open the lines up for questions, and I can really take an idea and take it through so people could understand the outcome. So teleclass has become a really popular service on our website because it's a good interactive process.
Sure is, and convenient too, isn't it? Really is. All right, you were talking about the high, and how people try to, get more and more. Is that like a serial killer? He gets high when he kills, so he has to keep killing, right?
Absolutely, and you could talk about a serial killer, or you could talk about a victim who stirs up his or her emotional states in order to produce some change in their internal chemistry. And it's an unfortunate thing, but whether you talk about overeating or undereating or gambling or murdering or biting your fingernails, whatever it is, it's all an attempt to try to make that feeling that we've memorized go away. Now, until we look at that feeling and we begin to observe how we think when we feel that way, when we begin to pay attention to habits or how we act when we're trying to make that feeling go away, until we begin to notice that feeling and begin to say, look, the more I try to make this feeling go away by something outside of me, the more I'm going to create a bigger gap. Now, as we begin to unmemorize those emotions and we begin to close the gap between how we appear and who we are, that's called transparency. And layer by layer, when we begin to make those changes inside of us, every time we unmemorize an emotion, we liberate energy out of the body. Now, if a person is living by certain emotions that they can't change, then their body is literally living in the past. Now, the body is the unconscious mind, George, and it does not know the difference between an experience in your life that produces an emotion and an emotion that you fabricate by thought alone. So a person who's living in a cycle of emotion that creates thoughts, that creates emotions, that creates thoughts, this loop, the body, as the unconscious mind, is literally living in the past, and it's believing that it's in the same circumstances 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And it's that type of chemical redundancy that begins to push the genetic buttons that begin to create disease. So as the person begins to unmemorize those emotions, they begin to liberate energy out of the body, and the body is free from the chains of those emotions. And that liberation of energy is called joy, and that joy doesn't come from outside of them. It actually comes from inside of them, and they begin to make those changes, not from trying to make the feeling go away by something or some substance or some action, but because they've overcome some aspect of themselves, and they begin to feel liberated. And that's what I call the natural state of being.
What do you see as the difference between consciousness and subconscious?
Well, I will say the difference between conscious mind and subconscious mind. Conscious mind is the part of us that we use to navigate pretty much our actions in our waking day. Now, if we think about it, we've been saying throughout the course of the show tonight that 95% of who we are by the time we're 35 years old is a set of subconscious or unconscious behaviors, emotional reactions, and thoughts and attitudes that become part of our identity. So if you understand that 95% of us, by the time we're 35, are living in subconscious states, and the body's the unconscious mind, then for the most part, most of the time, people are literally unconscious because they're running a series of programs, just like computer programs. So only when we truly become conscious, I mean really conscious, is being really present and being aware in that moment. And consciousness is awareness. Awareness is paying attention, and paying attention is noticing. And only when we wake up and become truly conscious are we able to begin to make measurable changes in our lives.
Well, that's a good point, too. So if people want to start changing, what do you recommend? What are the first things they start to do? Do they have to identify what that is, what they want to fix?
Absolutely. I mean, anytime we want to change anything, we got to first look at what is it that we want to change. And so, most people think that change happens outside of them. Like if we get rid of this person, or if we kick the cat out of the house, or it has something to do with changing, our external conditions. And really, the first aspect of change is really noticing how you think. Begin to become conscious of those emotions that bring you to a lower denominator every day, and become aware of your habits and behaviors that keep producing the same experiences, that keep reaffirming the same emotions. And this process, not a lot of people like to light a match in a dark place, but the process of change really is becoming conscious of those unconscious states. So, people say, well, where do I start? And I say, look, it's very simple. We're so distracted by our external environment that we wake up every day and do the same things as we started the show with, and we begin to reproduce the same levels of mind that begin to become automatic programs. Sit down in the morning and ask yourself this question: what is the greatest ideal or the expression of myself that I want to be today? And you begin to say, let me remind myself the thoughts that keep me returning back to the old self. Let me begin to review and begin to become aware of my unconscious habits so that I'm so aware of them and so conscious that they would never slip by me unnoticed today. And what are the emotions that keep me returning back to the same self that really are just a reflection of my past? And as we begin to remind ourselves who we no longer want to be, and we become conscious of those unconscious states, we're more prone to, in our waking day, not slip back to the old self sitting on the couch who just said earlier that they wanted to get in shape. And then if you said, what are the thoughts that I do want to put my energy behind? What are the behaviors I do want to demonstrate? And what are the emotions? What elevated emotions do I want to live by today? And if you said, I'm not going to get up from this meditation until I am this person, we would say then that the moment you began to think differently, you would begin to make your brain work in new sequences and new patterns and new combinations. And when you begin to speculate possibilities and begin to forecast new outcomes, and your brain begins to work differently, you're changing your mind. Now, when you do that repeatedly and you remind yourself who you want to be every day, you begin to install the neurological circuitry in your brain to look like the experience has already happened. In other words, as you begin to think differently and as you begin to plan new behaviors, your brain does not know the difference between the actual experience in your life that produces those circuits or what you fabricate by thought alone, which means we can change our brain just by thinking differently. Now, if we're so involved in that thought process that the thought in our mind literally becomes an experience, the end product of an experience is called an emotion. As we're sitting there in the comfort of our own home and we're beginning to think about a new way of being and reminding ourselves who we do want to be, if the thought becomes the experience, thoughts are the language of the brain, but feelings are the language of the body. And the moment the body begins to get a chemical signal because you begin to embrace that event, your body begins to epigenetically change and you move into a new state of being. Now, if you said, I'm going to memorize this state so that nothing, no person, no thing, no experience is going to remove me from this the remainder of my day, we could say that that new state of being is a new personality. And a new personality then, of course, creates a new personal reality.
Joe, what are epigenetics?
Well, they used to say, science used to say, biology used to say that, genes were the cause of disease. And now we know that it's a scientific fact that, less than 5% of the people on the planet are born with a genetic condition. The other 95% of the conditions are created from lifestyle, from choices. And genes then are actually what make proteins. And we actually have a gene that can begin to regulate in 2,000 different variations. The same gene can begin to function in 2,000 different variations. And when the environment or the chemistry outside of the cell signals the gene in a different way, the gene begins to respond differently, and that's epigenetics.
Breaking the habit of being yourself, how to lose your mind, create a new one. How long does it all take, Joe? What's the process?
Well, the way we've set it up in the book is we've designed a 4-week process for people. And we've asked
That's not bad.
No, it's not bad at all, because we've asked them to actually practice one particular skill for 1 week. And then after you get that first skill down, then practice the skill of the first week and add the second week. And then after you've gotten those down, add the third week, and then from there add the fourth week. Now, here's what we know. We've been teaching these workshops pretty much around the world for the last 3 years, and we've witnessed some pretty amazing changes in people's lives. And as I said, the hardest part of all of this is making the time to do it. If you took 40 minutes out of your day and you began to follow a very specific program and you stuck with it for a period of time, you would begin to change your mind and body. And when you change your mind and body, you're moving into a new state of being. So it takes a little bit of effort, and just like any skill, in the beginning, you have to restrain certain impulsive behaviors. You got to begin to focus a little bit better. You got to stay consistent with it. But if you do, we know, in fact, that it works.
The work through all this, when people are trying to change, is it okay to go to a friend and say, what would you change about me if you could do that?
We always joke around about this in our workshops, because men tend to be the ones that always say, I think I'm doing okay. And their wife is standing next to them
shaking her head,
saying, no, he really isn't. And so if people have difficulties, they're so busy, they're so absorbed in being who they think is okay, and they can't be objective enough to see themselves from another point of view. Of course, it's always a good idea to get someone who loves you enough to tell you the truth, to say, man, wow, you really complain a lot, or man, you really make excuses for yourself.
Well, sometimes the outsider sees it better than the individual.
Yeah, the observer from the outside, absolutely.
Yeah. I mean, that's one of the things I definitely would do. I'd go to a close person in your life and
That's
say,
always a good place to start.
Yeah,
absolutely.
If there's something about me you'd like to change, what? And then work on it.
Yeah.
And see what happens. What kind of results after 4 or 5 weeks do people see?
Well, we've seen, just amazing things happen over the course of 4 weeks or even less. As I've been saying all along, the process of change, or the biological model, requires unlearning and relearning. It requires breaking the habit of the old self and then reinventing a new self. It requires what we call in neuroscience pruning synaptic connections, which means you no longer fire and you no longer wire the same circuits, and you biologically change your circuitry, and then to sprout and fire and wire new connections in new circuits. It requires unmemorizing emotions that exist in your body and then reconditioning your body to a new mind and to a new emotion. It requires moving from your past memories into some future memories. And so everybody says, to change a habit, it takes 21 days. That actually, there's no real science to prove that. There's a lot of variables that allow us to change. I mean, it has to do with your attention span, how long in the process you do it, if you do it every single day, how often you do it. There's a lot of variables that create change. But what we've seen with people doing our meditations is that we've seen people diagnosed with MS, with lupus, with thyroid conditions like Hashimoto syndrome. We've seen people with cancers, diabetes, chronic pain, all kinds of physical ailments literally move from living in those states. And when they became somebody else, they began to signal new genes in new ways. And as they began to change their mind and body, they literally became somebody else, and they got pretty healthy.
Is that what you mean by spontaneous remissions?
Yeah, when my original work that I did was about 10 years ago, where I traveled around the world and interviewed people that were diagnosed with conditions like cancer and diabetes, et cetera, MS. And they were treating both conventionally and non-conventionally, and they were either staying the same or getting worse, and then all of a sudden they got better. And I wanted to see what the cause was that produced that effect. So when I interviewed them, I found out that there were some things that they had in common that I wanted to see if we would be able to reproduce. In other words, if we could hone in on the qualities that they did inside of them that produced that result, and then teach people how to do the same, would it produce a similar result? And so that's what got me, first of all, studying the science behind it. And once I understood the science behind it, of course, science is reproducible. So then I said, let's see if we can reproduce it. And when we followed that model of unlearning and relearning, reminding yourself who you no longer want to be, and then reminding yourself who you do want to be, and use meditation as the means to change the brain and body, we were able to see some pretty amazing spontaneous remission. Yes.
Do people get emotional doing this? Do they break down? Do they cry?
A lot of times, energy is stored in the body, and when it's stored in the body, it has to be released. And for some people, the release is emotional. Other people, it's just the opposite. It's absolutely freeing. That when they're freed from those emotional states that keep them in such pain or in such torture, there's a liberation of energy. And so it could come across as laughing, it could come across as crying, it could come across as a big emotional release in terms of a sound. We've seen all kinds of things, but really it's when the body's liberated, and when the body has that moment of liberation, it doesn't want to live in that state any longer. It wants to be free, and so we've seen all kinds of what we call abreactions or emotional reactions that take place, but it's not necessary.
Our guest, Dr. Joe Dispenza, we're talking about his work, Breaking the Habit of Being Yourself, how to simply lose your mind and create a new one. Male, female, does it work for both?
Oh, absolutely. We've seen it work across the board, young, old. People always say, God, I'm too old to change, and I always say, really? Have you seen the latest research on stroke victims? That if you have a stroke and you give the person the right knowledge and the right instruction, and they stay diligent with it, that the brain can literally rewire itself around the lesion, and people can regain mobility back, and that's been done many times and reproduced many times. So, and these people were in their 70s, and some of them had strokes, had paralysis for years. So the brain is that neuroplastic. If you give it the right learning, you give it the right information, and then the right instruction and the right feedback, the brain can literally rewire itself.
Well, it probably can. Are there any downsides to any of this, Joe?
Well, I haven't seen any downsides to it. The only thing at times people get a little bit nervous if they've had early abuse as a child, or they've had some difficult traumas, that sometimes some strong emotions come up, and we ask them to go slow and steady. But for the most part, the results that we've seen, George, have been really positive, and people not only change their health, but they change their life.
Super. Joe, we're going to come back, final hour, phone calls and stories. If you've changed your life, share it. Questions with Dr. Joe Dispenza next. Okay, this is the hour. We shall take your phone calls and also your stories. I'd love to hear if you've gone through your own metamorphosis, your own change. Check in with us, and we'll be back in a moment on Coast to Coast AM. And welcome back to Coast, Dr. Joe Dispenza with us, your phone calls as well and your stories. Joe, I bet you've heard incredible stories about people who've gone through change.
Oh, yeah, I've been really touched by simple people that really reasoned themselves to transformation. And it's actually what I use really to create the model of change, just by understanding people who have done it enough times, and I've seen some pretty miraculous things.
Give me an example.
Well, let's see. There was a man that was diagnosed with cancer, and he was actually on an elevator, and when he was getting off the floor, there was a man standing next to him who was a dermatologist, and the dermatologist pulled him off the elevator and said, hey, can I take a look at your face here? And he said, you have cancer on your face, malignant cancer. So this man scheduled the typical procedure. He had, he had it frozen, he had it cut out, and then, of course, he had it radiated. And then about 4 months later, it appeared on his neck, larger.
Oh.
So then he had it, same procedure, frozen, cut out, and radiated. 3 or 4 months later, it came back on his side. He did the same procedure, and finally it showed up on his calf, and that was about the size of an apricot. So he said, he had seen the movie What the Bleep Do We Know that I was in, and then he read my book and read a couple other books, and he began to reason, like, well, what is this marble rolling around in my brain that keeps creating this condition? Now, if emotions are the end product of experience, he began to look at, he said, what emotion have I memorized that keeps signaling the same gene in the same way every single day? And he realized when he sat down and looked at himself that he lived his whole life in resentment, resented someone or something every day.
Jeez.
And so he began to look at the thoughts that created the resentment. In other words, when he was feeling resentment, what were the thoughts that he would think? And he listed them all down. He wrote them all down. And he became conscious of every single thought, so none of those thoughts would slip by his awareness again. And then he said, what are the behaviors that I demonstrate? What do I do? What do I say when I'm feeling this emotion? And he began to observe himself in his life, and he wrote down every behavior, every action, every verbalization that he made when he felt resentment. And then he said, what are the other emotions that are created from resentment? Do I judge? Am I impatient? And he began to become conscious of his unconscious self. And he reviewed this list every single day. And what he didn't know that he was doing is that he was biologically no longer firing and no longer wiring the same circuits in his brain, and he was no longer emotionally signaling the same genes in the same way that created the disease. After about 5 or 6 days, he started to feel really lifted. He started to feel really good because he began to break that emotional state. He began to say, when I go back into my life, who do I want to be? And he began to think about the thoughts he did want to believe in and the behaviors he did want to demonstrate and the emotions that he did want to live by. And as he began to think in new and unusual ways, he moved into a new state of being. And when he returned back into his life, about 10 days later, he was in the shower getting ready for the surgery to have the cancer removed. And when he was in the shower, he looked down at his leg, and the cancer literally had fallen off his leg. It literally just fell off.
That's amazing.
And he became somebody else, and a new personality creates a new personal reality, and he was totally healed. How
important, Joe, is positive thinking?
Well, this isn't positive thinking, George, because...
no, it's not. I know.
Because a lot of times, let's just break this down. Every time we have a thought, we make a chemical. If we have a great thought or an unlimited thought, we turn on a set of circuits in our brain in a very specific sequence or pattern that produces a level of mind that signals another part of the brain that makes a chemical for us to feel exactly the way we're just thinking, great or unlimited. If we have a negative thought or an unhappy thought, we turn on a different set of circuits in the brain that produce a different level of mind that makes a different blend of chemicals to make us feel exactly the way we're just thinking, negative or unhappy. Now, the moment we begin to feel the way we think, because the brain is in constant communication with the body, we begin to think the way we feel, which makes more chemicals for us to feel the way we think and think the way we feel. And this cycle of thinking and feeling and thinking creates what I call a state of being. So if a person has an insecure thought, they begin to feel insecure. The moment they feel insecure, they think more insecure thoughts. And this cycle goes on for certain people for 20 or 30 years until they say, I am insecure. And whenever we say, I am anything, the mind and body are working together. Now, it's the repetition of this cycle of thinking and feeling over time that conditions the body to be the mind. Now, when the body becomes the mind, that's called a habit. So then, if that is a subconscious program, then 5% of the conscious mind is trying to work against 95% of what the person has memorized subconsciously. So if the person's thinking positively with the 5% of their conscious mind, but they've been feeling negatively for the last 25 years, that's mind and body in opposition. If the person's praying for a new life and a new opportunity, but they're feeling guilty, that's mind and body in opposition. So positive thinking doesn't work a lot of the times because the person is working against how they internally feel, which is negatively. We have to literally become somebody else.
Okay, let's go to the phones. We'll pick it up by going to Oceanside, California. Michael's with us, first of all. Go ahead, Michael.
Good evening, gentlemen.
Hi.
I have been grieving my mom's passing for 3.5 years, and I've tried different medications and hypnotherapy, CDs, and I'm a person who doesn't stop trying to help himself, but nothing really helped me until 2 weeks ago. I went for a massage, and the next day I felt terrible because I guess I had 3.5 years of toxins built up in my body from all the grief and sadness and so on. And ever since I had that massage, after the toxins dissipated, that took maybe a day or two, I have felt so much better since, and I'm going to be going weekly now to have a massage. And I just thought I would bring that up, that that's what really helped me.
Sure, let's talk about that, because the latest research shows now that even massage epigenetically begins to change the body. But it's an amazing concept that the body is the unconscious mind. In other words, it doesn't know the difference between an experience that produces an emotion and a thought that creates the emotion. What most people don't know is that when they begin to think about a past experience, they produce the same chemistry in the brain and in the body as if the event was happening. Now, you do that over and over again, you begin to literally condition the body emotionally to become the mind. So it's now the energy or the emotion is stored in the body. It's not stored in the mind. It's literally in the body. So there's a whole new field emerging that's really helping people. That's really what's called the energy psychology movement, or what I call implicit change movement, in which we're addressing the body. We're no longer doing talk therapy because that doesn't change anything. So when you do massage, or you do acupuncture or chiropractic, or what's called EFT or EMDR or Psych-K or body talk, this is all addressing the body as the subconscious mind. And when we begin to release that energy that's stored in the body, it's literally like taking a log out of a log jam. And the person has a lot of waste that begins to be released. The body begins to reorganize itself. The person literally views their life from a different place because they feel better. And when they feel better, they begin to make different choices. They begin to think differently. They begin to behave differently. And they literally step out of their past.
Does that help you?
Yes. Well, in fact, 25 years ago, I came up with a saying that the body is the pet of the mind.
That's a good analogy. Thanks, Michael. Next up, Joe in New York City. Hi, Joe. Go ahead.
Hi, George. How are you?
Good, Joe.
I'd like to ask your guest, Dr. Dispenza, about OCD. You mentioned rewiring earlier in the show, and I'd like to know if that's possible to achieve permanent relief from OCD.
Yeah, there's some great research being done by Jeffrey Schwartz, that shows that the biggest thing that seems to help people with OCD is to move into the present moment. And if they can just acknowledge the feeling that they're having and stay with the feeling without doing anything and be with it for a long enough period of time, that type of stasis literally unfires and unwires the circuits in the brain that are literally working too hard with OCD. And with OCD, it's like a part of the brain that's like the gear shifter, can't shift gears. And so being present and working on noticing the feeling and seeing how long you can stay with that feeling without doing something to relieve it or make that feeling go away is the beginning stages of changing it. And Schwartz's work is pretty novel and has been very successful in it.
Okay, thanks, Joe.
Thank you.
Let's go to Mike in Los Angeles. Welcome to the program. Go ahead, Mike.
Hey, guys. How you doing?
Good.
Listen, I just have something to add here real quick. It's small compared to the previous callers, and I'm sure you'll have a lot more following. But, I'm going through a lot of stuff right now in my life. And one thing I did that I noticed that made me feel a little better, at least, was I logged off of Facebook. It seemed to give me a false connection to people, even to people in my past, even to people around me. They'd put stuff, and I knew the stuff they posted was bogus, but and then pretty soon it was like a novelty thing, okay, but then I was like, I check in and it's like, well, someone didn't write me, or what, isn't there more to this experience? And it was like a weight on me.
Sure.
It gave me, and when I signed off it just felt a little bit more that I could address my own issues and my own future rather than kind of wasting my time in the past or a false reality. And I'll take your comments on the air.
Wow,
that's a pretty good analogy, isn't it, Joe?
It's a great choice that you made. And let's talk about reaffirming an identity. We reaffirm our identity emotionally and neurologically by the things that we repeatedly do. So if we're looking outside of ourselves constantly to try to make some feeling go away inside of us, and we're distracting ourselves from those feelings, as we said earlier, we literally get lost in the confusion of who we think we are. The moment we begin to make other choices, look, when you play a computer game or you interact on Facebook, what most people don't know is that every time something that you do during the computer game or during the Facebook makes you feel good, it begins to turn on the pleasure centers in your brain, and your brain begins to squirt out a certain amount of dopamine, which makes you feel good. Now, if you keep doing that repeatedly, the pleasure centers begin to recalibrate at a higher level, and you become dependent on something outside of you to make you feel good. And then if something doesn't, you expect something to happen on Facebook and it doesn't happen, then you don't get the high that you're looking for, so then you try to create it by staying on it longer. And that sounds like an addiction to me. So as we begin to remove ourselves from the things that hijack our pleasure centers, we begin to find more balance in our brain and body. And the bottom line is that if you keep doing that extensively and the pleasure centers get hijacked to such a high level, then we can't find pleasure in anything. We can't go watch a sunset. We can't, go visit an elder. Or we can't take the dog for a walk because we're overstimulated to such a degree. And that's what technology is really doing for a lot of people. And so that's a great choice because it's really changing your brain chemistry back to normal, and you'll begin to feel more like yourself than you have in a long time.
Joe, is an addiction mental or physical?
Oh, it's both. An addiction is something you can't stop. It feels really good while you're doing it, and it feels really bad when you stop it. And so if you think about any addiction, if you're angry, right, and I said to you, hey, why are you so angry? Why don't you just stop? Well, if you can't stop the anger, then there's an addiction to anger. If you're playing a video game and I say, hey, it's time for dinner, break it down, and you can't stop the video game, then that's an addiction. If you're, interacting on Facebook and you have to check your Facebook page every 15 minutes or so, and you can't stop that, that sounds like an addiction to me. So there's neurological, biological, and physiological components that ultimately lead to physical changes.
Are we creating addicts by doing that?
I think so, because if you think about it, what happens, let's talk about video gaming. A child playing a video game and they're blowing somebody up or shooting somebody or breaking through.
And they don't leave. They're there all the time.
They're there all the time. And every time they break through a level or kill somebody or beat somebody up or strike somebody, they're producing dopamine in their brain, and the brain wakes up momentarily. Now, if you take that child and they spend an hour playing video games, and now they go to school, and learning should be a reward in and of itself, but now they can't get their brain to turn on because they just overstimulated it and they can't learn, then what do you think they do to turn their brain on? They act out. They get in trouble to release adrenaline and epinephrine to get their brain woken up for a period of time, and that begins to create attention problems. Now, fast forward 20 years down the line when this child is now an adult and they have to address some really uncomfortable situations emotionally in their life. Instead of facing those conditions and actually moving through them, they'll try to escape by trying to make that uncomfortable feeling go away, and that's when we start to create a culture of addiction.
That's interesting. It's pretty fascinating work that you do. How about colleagues? People agree with you?
I think it's becoming pretty well known now that that pleasure centers are being altered by technology. I think it's becoming the standard, and the physiology is in place, and I think it's just the level, creating the exposure for people to really wake up to it and then to begin to make different choices.
Do you think when people hit their heads, it could change their personality, Joe?
Oh, absolutely. Brain injuries and brain trauma, are just one of the major things that begin to not only change a person's personality, but ultimately lead to neurodegenerative diseases later on in their life. And if you have children and they're playing sports and from skiing to whatever, bicycles, and they're not wearing a helmet, you're taking a huge risk, because it's those type of deceleration injuries where the brain is the consistency of a soft-boiled egg, and it's in this bony structure. And when you have an impact, that brain slushes around in there. It begins to create areas that begin to no longer function properly, and now we're in trouble.
All right, we're going to come back with you, Joe. We're going to take final phone calls in just a moment. Plus, I'll tell you what's in store for our next Coast to Coast show. I'm George Norrie, and we'll be right back. On our next Coast to Coast program, Lori Toy joins us back after a while. She has created a map of what she thinks the future will look like. It's an amazing story. And when we come back in just a moment, we'll take final phone calls here with Dr. Joe Dispenza on Coast to Coast AM. Joe, how much of this is admitting, of course, that you have a problem or a situation that you need to fix?
Well, recognizing and admitting is always the first two steps to change. You have to recognize that there's something that you want to change, and then you have to admit that there's something that you want to change about yourself, and then declare it so that you can begin the process of working inside of you, and outside of you, as a matter of fact. So whether you say to yourself, gosh, I want to lose 10 pounds, I have to recognize that I'm overweight, and I have to admit that I'm eating too much, and I have to begin to declare that I'm going to make these changes. It just seems to be the formula that people tend to follow when they're interested in making permanent changes. And so admission, or beginning to admit, is really beginning to tell the truth about who you are, instead of hiding it, getting it out there and saying, okay, I admit that I have this problem and I want to change it. And it could be losing weight. It could be, any type of thing that we want to change. It's a good place to start.
Okay, let's go to final calls now, if we can. St. Cloud, Minnesota. John's a first-time caller. Hi, John. Thanks for calling.
Yes, good morning, gentlemen.
Morning.
Good morning.
George, love your show. You do such a great job of opening up people's minds, which is definitely needed now.
Well, it sure is. Thank you, John.
I was actually calling because you were talking about extraordinary events earlier. Joe was meeting people that had extraordinary events in their life. And last February, I went through 3 days of, I guess you call it sleep paralysis or whatnot. After the 3 days, for about the next 3 months, I had vibrations. And I have degenerative disc disease and spina bifida, live in chronic pain, whatnot, always have. But I went to the doctors, did the tests and things, and to find out exactly what it was. And everything came back negative. So I started looking a little bit further, but I started going more into the metaphysical. And I found out more about the conscious mind and astral travel and things like that. And that led to learning things about stuff like the biotuner that's made by Bob Beck, or the lucid light stimulators, different things like that. Have you heard of those devices?
Absolutely. Let's talk about a few things here that's happening to you, first of all. When you move into that state of sleep paralysis, this is what I call the theta state of the brain, because this is the state where your body is asleep but your mind is awake. And this is what I call magic land, because this is the place where the paranormal happens to people. When people start to have these vibratory sensations, I've certainly had them myself, the first thing is that it's so unknown that we tend to think that there's something wrong instead of something right. And that vibration is information that's coming into your nervous system and coming into your body. Your body moves in and out of the quantum field very, very frequently. And when it leaves, it gains information. And when it comes back, it brings that information with it. So when you begin to move into this altered state, that's information coming into your body. And the idea when that happens is to surrender into it, because if you surrender into it and you relax into it and you let it consume you, more than likely an uncommon or an unusual event will happen, whether it's a remission from your pain, whether it's an out-of-body experience, whether it's an interdimensional experience. But that is the signature of what typically happens when people begin to open up to other levels of consciousness. Now, all of those different devices that you've talked about is literally, those devices are designed to create an opening or some type of coherence or some type of order in a body that has been in some way disorganized because of stress or disease or whatever. So I always think that, if you look at it, they're adjuncts to getting your mind and body aligned. But the more important thing is that the fact that it's happening to you is an important time in your life. And my recommendation is to relax, to surrender into it, and let the unknown take you for a ride.
In the same way you say changing your mind can make you healthy, can it also make you sick?
Well, we know without a doubt that the chemicals of stress, the adrenaline and the cortisols, those are the chemicals that pull the genetic buttons or pull the trigger that create disease. It's an absolute fact. We talked about earlier that we can turn on the stress response just by thought alone. We can think of a past memory, or we can forecast some worst-case scenario, and we can turn on the stress response just by thinking about those conditions, because the body begins to physiologically change by the instruction of the mind. So if we know then that the chemicals of stress create disease, and we know that that our thoughts are related to turning on the stress response, then it begs the question, can our thoughts make us sick? Well, the answer is absolutely yes, because if we can turn on the stress response just by thought alone, and stress makes us sick, then absolutely that is the mind-body connection. Now, the real question is, if our thoughts can make us sick, is it possible that our thoughts make us well? And that is an important question to begin to ask, because we know from a scientific fact that the elevated emotions of gratitude, of thankfulness, of love, of joy, these elevated states that exist outside of those survival emotions, above those survival emotions, begin to signal new genes in new ways. Well, think about it. If you're giving thanks ahead of an actual experience, the emotional signature of gratitude means the event has already happened. So when we couple a clear intention, a very clear intention in our mind, and an intention is getting clear on what we want, with an elevated emotion of how we would feel if the event already happened, independent of waiting for the environmental signal to happen, but we create the emotion by thought alone, we begin to signal new genes in new ways. And if you're able to do that every single day, there's a good chance your body will begin to change to reflect a new mind.
Next up, let's go to our wild card line, Michael in Stanford, Indiana. Michael, thanks for calling. Go ahead.
Hi, George. Thank you.
Sure.
First off, I'd like to say, Joe, I'm a first-time caller, and I have just agreed with everything that you've had to say tonight, and especially whenever you touched on if something was to happen to someone whenever they were younger, because I feel like with what you're speaking about, at a younger age, that's going to be a whole lot longer time of things building up and toxins being in your body, and things weigh in on a person's mind. And I just wonder if that plays a part with the anxiety role.
Absolutely. Let's talk about anxiety, and I'll make it brief. But what is anxiety? Anxiety is trying to forecast, or you begin to obsess about some really terrible scenario, condition that may happen in your life. And as you continuously review it and prepare yourself for that to happen, and you get ready for it, your body begins to physiologically change, and it begins to live in the future. And that state is called anxiety. Now, if you keep obsessing about something that happened to you in the past, and you do it over and over again, some terrible scenario, you begin to condition your body into a state of depression or hopelessness or powerlessness. And so one of the problems that we have as human beings is that we're always trying to predict and get ready for something bad to happen so that we're ready for it. Now, that's kind of a funny thing, because when we get it right and we're prepared and we actually, do it properly, and we say, hey, you should hang out with me. Look how smart I am. I've actually done this. But what happens when it doesn't happen? When it doesn't happen, that's called anxiety. That's called neurosis. That's called obsessive-compulsive disorder, because you're trying to forecast some scenario and it never happens, and that's what begins to knock the brain and body out of balance. And so when we have childhood traumas or we have incidents that happen early on in our life, for the most part, we don't understand even how they happened or why they happened. And so my model is very simple. Forget about the experience, because by thinking about the experience or talking about the experience, you're beginning to fire and wire those circuits in your brain to reaffirm that identity. And if you work yourself up into an emotional state, you begin to recondition your body into the past. I say, forget about the event. Just work on the emotion and begin to unmemorize those emotions. And as you begin to overcome an emotion, a memory without the emotional charge is called wisdom, and that's the name of the game. That's why we're here.
Some people do have, compulsive natures about them. Is that necessarily bad, Joe?
When it interferes with your normal life, then it is. But, there are plenty of people in history that were geniuses, that were very over-focused on concepts. They're very over-focused on their inventions. They're single-minded in the way that they pursued their passions, musicians and artists. So as long as it doesn't interfere with your normal life, and as long as you can stop it so that you can function, then it's a healthy thing. It's passion. It's a single-minded focus. But when it begins to interfere in our sleep, or interfere with our eating patterns, or interfere with our family life, or interfere with some things that we do, and it begins to become predictable and patterned, then we got to start looking at how we can change it.
Okay, let's go next to Paramus, New Jersey, east of the Rockies. William, good morning.
Hi, George. How are you?
Okay.
I've been a long-time listener, actually, since I was 11.
Thank you.
So you're like
we've grown up together, huh?
But no, I actually wanted to share an experience, and then I had a question. I just wanted to get both of your takes on this. Growing up, I was severely in school throughout my whole life, high school, middle school, bullied by my peers. And then when I graduated high school, even though I had exceptional grades and an exceptional GPA, my parents stopped me from going away to college. So, but I feel as though I was able to use all that to my benefit and turn it around, because I felt like I played the victim role forever inside, because I just listened to everyone. And within the past couple of years, I'm 22 now, I was able to write for a couple of magazines, local magazines, freelance, and get a large following for myself. And I actually work at a local radio station, and this is all without having completed a college degree.
Good for
and
you.
I also have extremely notable references. I actually organized a benefit in Manhattan last year that featured a lot of notable DJs, musicians, and reality personalities. So I was able to do all this on my own. But right now I'm almost at a crossroads in my life where I'm actually trying to get a job in a bigger market at a radio station. But I'm wondering if I should go back to and try to complete a degree, or if it's really necessary, because I've been able to accomplish so much on my own so far, and I've been sort of having a little bit not anxiety, but sort of been contemplating it constantly, and I'm just wondering what your take is on it, and if you think the reason that I'm kind of at a crossroads right now is just because I've been thinking about my past a lot.
Well, this is a really great question. Number one, first of all, just want to acknowledge you for overcoming your past, because the choices that you made in pursuing your passion and pursuing a future at 22 years old, you literally changed your biology by doing that. The fact that you said, I'm not going to be defined by the things that happened to me in my past, and I'm going to get beyond these emotions, and I'm going to create the life that I want, is a testament for you that you can do just about anything in your life. Now, my answer is both. Never stop learning. Every time you learn, you make a new connection in your brain, and that becomes the raw materials, the forerunner for new experiences. So whether you get a degree or you take online classes or you go to evening classes, if you're that skilled and that talented in terms of what you've just described to me, then do both. Continue your passion, continue to pursue it, continue to step outside the box, continue to lay yourself out there, but never stop learning. Always continue to learn, because as you continue to learn, you will continue to evolve and grow. So do both of those things at the same time, and keep going, and let the universe take you to where you need to be.
All right, good advice, by the way. Sacramento, California. Harry, it's your turn on Coast to Coast. Go ahead, Harry.
Hi, George. I've been listening to this program for 20-some years, and I say this is probably in the top 2 or 3% of my favorite shows.
Oh, good. All right.
This is something I'm going to look more into. A few years ago, I went through a divorce, probably 15 years ago, and I really went through a bad time after that. I was addicted to drugs heavily, lost my home, and then I didn't want my son to see me this way. He was with my wife, but it came to the point where I knew I was going to not be in his life at all if I didn't do something about it. So I went to a recovery house for 90 days, and I was able to kick the drug, and I've been clean ever since. It's been I'm in my 6th year, and haven't touched it. So. But when I was doing that, I used to go out at night and just kind of, I guess you would call it meditate, just by myself out and look at the stars. And sometimes I could swear I could hear my brain tear. I was going through such a heavy a change, and actually I think it was, things started to make sense to me that I seriously feel that I changed as a person, and I went back kind of to my childhood, to where I understood that it was so much easier to do. It was a lot easier to do the right things than I had learned older. If the right things came to me more naturally, the right way to think, the right way to talk to, to treat people.
Mm-hmm.
And I changed just so many people told me that I was just a different person, but so I understand a little bit of what you're talking about. But what I would like to ask you about is guilt. How do you look at guilt? And I'll get off the phone and listen to your answer.
We've got about a minute to go here, Joe.
Okay, really simple. Guilt is when you feel bad about something. And I always tell my children that the chemicals that run in your body after an experience last for 90 seconds to 2 minutes. Anything past then, you're either faking it or you're becoming addicted to it. Huh. So guilt means that you feel bad about something, but that's not who you really are. The best thing you can do for the people in your life, for yourself, for your body, is to let go of that guilt and step out as a worthy man, ready to engage in a new life, and leave that in your past.
Joe, would you give out your website, if you would, please?
Sure. Our website is just drjoedispenza.com, drjoedispenza.com.
Name of the book, Breaking the Habit of Being Yourself. Joe, thanks so much, and good luck. What's your next evolution here?
Well, we're teaching advanced courses now, and it seems to be changing people's lives, and people are having amazing mystical experiences. So that's my interest now.
Good for you, Joe. Hey, thanks for being on the program, Joe.
Thank you so much, George.
Appreciate it. Dr. Joe Dispenza, fascinating book, but it's a fascinating discussion as well. He's also a best-selling author. His first book was called Evolve Your Brain. And you know what? Everybody needs to change a little bit. It's a great way to do it. For Dan Galante, Tom Danheiser, Lisa Lyon, Lex Lonehood, Shadlan Desur, Stephanie Smith, Ross Mitchell, George Knapp, John B. Wells, Ian Punnett, and Art Bell, I'm George Norrie, somewhere out there on Coast to Coast AM. We'll see you on our next edition. Until then, be safe.